Welcome to Mrs. True Crime. Today's video is an in-depth look into people living with dead bodies. It's a tale of grief and spirituality. If you're triggered by anything dealing with death, feel free to click off this video. Perhaps check out a jellyfish video for some lighthearted content. If not, I'm Nicole. Let's get started. About a year ago, my grandmother died. She was 97 and it was natural causes. We lived together. Well, more specifically, she raised me. She annoyed me into being kind, into notifying others when something wasn't right, and most importantly, to be aware of where I am and who I am. When she died, it truly and really sucked. It was like a part of me was gone. She was my biggest cheerleader. She'd tell anyone who would listen that I was going to be the world's best novelist. Well, that's not exactly going as planned, but I don't think she would hate what I'm doing. In fact, I think she'd be concerned because of the subject matter, but proud of me for doing what I love. That was my grandma. If you loved something and was passionate, she supported you. Honestly, I didn't know how to start this video or the script. I went back and forth about facts and quotes, and nothing felt right. The only thing that I felt comfortable with was talking about my grandma. I guess it's because I understand the people I'm going to discuss. No, I didn't keep my grandma's body in a bedroom somewhere, but I get the idea of not knowing how to let go and grieve. I get the idea of wanting someone you love more than anyone to stay with you. I get it. I wish my grandma was still here. Every day of every moment. I miss her laughter, her screaming at me to do the dishes, her kindness. So today, I don't want to stuff facts down y'all's throat. I don't want to beat you over the head with statistics about deaths and funerals. I just want to tell a story. A story about 3 people who cared and loved and lost. I hope you all enjoy. Robert Kulfer loved his tight-knit Minnesotan family. There was the patriarch, Fenwick, employed at KSTP-TV, and the matriarch, Evelyn. The two were bound in love for 58 years and shared a small home on the 4,000 block of Sandra Lane in White Bear Lake. Richard, Robert's twin brother, wasn't in good health, but not a negative report can be found about him. For years, they enjoyed, argued, and loved like any family. But on September 14th, 2011, at the age of 83, Fenwick died. An emptiness filled the small home Evelyn shared with her husband, so her sons took it upon themselves to move in. Their neighbors described the family as, quote, very quiet, very polite, never said a bad word against anybody. You couldn't ask for better neighbors, unquote. As the years continued, Evelyn and Richard's health declined, pinning Robert as sole caretaker for the two. The change in his family's vigor also affected the exterior of the home. The grass grew taller, the trucks sat stationed in the driveway, and overall movement was absent. Neighbors worried about them and contacted police for a welfare check. At 7:30 a.m. in September 2016, officers arrived, but before they could knock on the door, they discovered something unexpected. Through the main floor window, officers saw a dead body. They forced their way inside, meeting 59-year-old Robert walking down the stairs. Entering the home, they reported smelling decay, and soon understood why. The body authorities witnessed through the window was 92-year-old Evelyn Kulfer. She rests in her upstairs bedroom untouched. Reports say that her body was decayed and skeletal. Quote, slowly, I saw them bring one body out. Then I watched and saw them go back in the house with the empty gurney, so I knew then that there was another one in there, unquote. Downstairs in the basement bathroom was the mummified remains of 58-year-old Richard Kulfer. Robert explained to police that both died of natural causes. He vaguely described finding his brother's body July 2015 in a chair and, quote, eventually moving it to the bathroom as it was in the way, unquote. As for his mother, Robert said that he knew she was dying in August 2015, just months after Richard's death, and didn't want to be around for it. On the day of her death, he drove around for hours, and when he returned home, his mother had passed. Quote, "I watched my mother die," he said. "She always said she wanted to die at home. She didn't have any burial plans." Unquote. His loved ones dying so close together greatly affected Robert, and he couldn't bring himself to bury the bodies. Months after their deaths, he wrote other family members telling them that both were in bad health and that they didn't want to talk on the phone or see anyone. Quote, "I am not some nutball," Robert said in a telephone interview. "People think I am, but I'm not. I love them." Unquote. Coroner's report found that Robert was telling the truth. Both his mother and brother died months apart from natural causes. Both also received disability and Social Security checks, and considering the circumstances, Robert was arrested a few days later on suspicion of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. However, the money wasn't touched since their deaths, and Robert was released only to be rearrested a year later for interference with a dead body or scene of death for moving his brother's body and neglecting to tell authorities of the deaths. The charge carried a maximum sentence of a year and/or a $3,000 fine, but Robert only received 3 days in jail and 2 years probation. Police Captain Dale Hager said, quote, "This is our way of introducing this case unto the court. We do believe his actions violated the law. Moving the body of his brother disrupted the death scene. We're depending on our partners in the court system to make a good decision. I think he was just filled with anxiety and fear, and he stated it was just too difficult for him to go through the process of burying his mother and brother." Unquote. The White Bear Lake home was deemed temporarily uninhabitable by the city on September 21, 2016. The structure housed bugs, flies, maggots, and bodily fluids. It was deeply cleaned, and Robert moved back in sometime later. As far as reports can tell, he has tried to continue living his life. He asked simply, quote, "I was traumatized. What would you do?" Unquote. Jean Stevens' love was large and vibrant. Her love was unforgiving and long-lasting. It reached beyond hospital beds, world wars, and graves. When the story of the little old lady of Wyalusing, Pennsylvania reached mainstream media, she was flooded with 70 or so letters from around the world, sharing sympathy and compassion. Aside from the cards furnished with warm words, there were also fruit cakes, mints, and other treats for the 91-year-old to dig into. Quote, "I think there's a lot of people that can relate, that you don't want to let go when you lose somebody." Unquote. Yet with every positive reinforcement, there was a negative outcry or unfunny throwaway line at Jean's expense. But she never allowed others to dampen her spirits. Perhaps that's what drew her husband of 60 years to her. How World War II vet James Stevens and Jean met, I couldn't say, but the two wed sometime in 1942. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, then worked at the General Electric Corporation plant in Liverpool, New York. From there, he became an auto mechanic. After decades together, James surrendered to Parkinson's disease on May 21, 1999. The thought of her husband spending eternity locked away in a coffin 6 feet in the earth didn't sit well with Jean, so she and an unknown friend dug up James after his funeral. Dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and blue knitted tie, James's body was placed on a couch in a detached garage. Quote, "I could see him. I could look at him. I could touch him." Now, some people have a terrible feeling. They say, "Why do you want to look at a dead person?" Oh my gracious. Well, I felt differently about death. Unquote. Jean found comfort in talking to her late husband about any and everything, and she enjoyed the company, as well as the notion that it was her little secret. Though Jean lost her husband, she was never truly alone. Many people visited her home, including her twin sister June. June and Jean were intensely close, so close in fact that the two married brothers. June wed Army vet Allison Kemp Stevens sometime in 1957, and for the next 36 years resided in West Hartford, Connecticut until Allison's untimely death on December 11, 1993. June, described as, quote, "an artist and gourmet cook," unquote, maintained the home for 16 more years. From the comfort of her couch or bed, she phoned her sister several times a week and wrote to her often. In 2008, June was diagnosed with cancer. Suffering from pain, she was still glad to see her twin walking through her door. That following year, on October 3rd, June was laid to rest in Jean's backyard, but her burial didn't last long. Neighbor James Flanagan dug up June and placed her on an old couch in a spare room off of the bedroom in Jean's home. Jean dressed her in her best housecoat and sprayed her favorite expensive perfume. Quote, I'd go in and I'd talk and I'd forget. I put glasses on her. When I put the glasses on, it made all the difference in the world. I would fix her up. I'd fix her face up all the time. Jean added, I could touch her and look at her and talk to her. Death is very hard for me to take. Unquote. While Jean's feelings on death may be hard to understand, she also didn't want her loved ones below ground because of her claustrophobia, a fear both her and her sister shared. Having the ones she loved most so close to her brought the small woman solace. But in mid-June 2010, her world changed. An unknown tipster, Jean suspects her late husband's relatives, called the police about the bodies hidden throughout her home. The county promptly took away the bodies, but Jean wasn't charged with abuse of a corpse. Her neighbor was. 62-year-old James Flanagan was charged July 2010 on a misdemeanor, but the next year on October 6th, the charges were dropped. No preliminary hearing was ever scheduled, with District Attorney Daniel Barrett saying, quote, we made our point. The likely penalty would have been a small fine. We had other cases where we needed to devote our resources and time, unquote. No charges were ever filed against the unknown individuals who assisted with James's unearthing, as the statute of limitations had expired. The bodies remained in the morgue for some time, where Jean became acquainted with coroner Tom Carmen. Quote, I want to get Jimmy and June back to her just as soon as I possibly can, unquote. And that he did. Bradford County authorities told Jean that she could have the bodies back if she built an above-ground vault. For months, many worked on a mausoleum that would rest on her property. The end result was an oversized shed large enough to house 8 bodies. Jean exclaimed excitement in placing her husband and sister inside, and that she also hoped to place her deceased mother and father in there as well. It is presumed that James and June were placed inside, as well as one more body. On February 29, 2012, Jean Stevens died at the age of 92. She is presumably buried alongside her sister and husband. In a 2011 interview prior to her death, Jean said of dying, quote, is that the grand final? There must be somebody who created this. It didn't come up like mushrooms. I don't always go to church, but I want to believe, unquote. You've been diagnosed with cervical cancer, and 8 years later you're told you only have 6 months to live. What's your plan? Chemo or no chemo? Radiotherapy or no radiotherapy? See more doctors for options, or go about it your own way? For 47-year-old Derby native Wendy Davison, she and her family band together and embarked on a spiritual cross-country journey that added 3 years to her life. Wendy refused chemotherapy and radiotherapy and, quote, truly embraced natural health, unquote. Her and her family, consisting of her husband Russell and 2 sons, bought a caravan and traveled around Europe. They indulged in new and different cuisine, learned to snowboard, and worked remotely. But around September 2016, Wendy's suffering became too much, and they ventured back to Derby. She was enrolled in hospice, visiting the Macmillan ward at the Royal Derby Hospital since their journey back, but Wendy refused to die hooked up to machines and tubes. Quote, about 5 years ago, we were part of a Steiner Community biodynamic study group. One of the members said they would sit with their dead at home, because sometimes when the body dies, the spirit doesn't always leave straight away. If there is confusion at the point of death, the spirit might hang around, so you have the body in a familiar place, your home, with familiar people, friends, and family. So if the spirit is confused and hanging around, at least they're in familiar surroundings with familiar people, and will be reassured instead of being in a black plastic bag in a mortuary. We heard that and thought, that makes complete sense, unquote, says Russell. Russell and Wendy were childhood sweethearts who fell madly in love at 12. The two were separated for unknown reasons, where they married and had children with others, only to reunite 13 years later. Together they ventured on a hippie-free spirited lifestyle that allowed them to embrace the taboo of death and natural healing. They researched with death doulas at the Buddha Field Festival in Somerset and watched the Japanese film Departures, focusing on the ritualized washing of the body. The two purchased what Wendy referred to as her cocoon, and Russell arranged for a doctor to visit his ailing wife every 2 weeks. They prepared her celebration of life, and as long as they could, immersed themselves into what little time remained. Months passed, and a new year had begun. but Wendy was getting worse. Nonetheless, Russell stated that she, quote, never once complained and has never felt sorry for herself. She was focused on gratitude every day and showed more bravery, courage, and grace than I thought it was possible to have, unquote. On April 10th, 2017, Wendy stopped eating. 5 days later, she stopped drinking. From this point onward, she was sedated. Russell described his wife's last moments, saying that she communicated enough to say she loved him and that she no longer felt pain. On April 21st, 2017, at 4:40 a.m., Wendy Davison took her last breath in her husband and son Dylan's arms. Her body was then ceremoniously washed. A beautiful flowered dress was lifted onto her body, and she was then placed into her cocoon holding her Buddhist prayer beads. Russell detailed the agony of the first night, which involved a great deal of sobbing. Afterward, he got into bed next to his wife and read until he fell asleep. Quote, there was nothing that upset me about being in a room with a dead body. It was the opposite. Wendy's body was still there, and that was really comforting, unquote. A Buddhist mantra played on a loop in the bedroom. Flowers were then placed around Wendy's body, and an altar was dressed in her honor. The family, that extended to include their son's girlfriends, held a small vigil at the edge of the bed for their loved one. Over the next 6 days, family and friends were encouraged to come and say goodbye to Wendy. They could sit with her, speak to her, and remember fond memories together. The family expected a small number of visitors, but were welcomed by 70 or more. Those who were once scared of death and the idea of it came to visit and light incense and bask in the spirituality of the vigil. At least one person was always by Wendy's side. Then at 8:30 a.m. on Thursday, April 27th, 2017, Russell and his son placed Wendy into their car and drove her to the crematorium. Less than a month later, a celebration of life was held, and donations that were gifted to the family were given to the National Health Center in Derby, the Wendy Center, that is, named in her honor. Quote, I would recommend it to absolutely everybody, not just for people with spiritual beliefs. Even if you are an atheist, you would benefit just in terms of emotional decompression. Your loved one dies, and normally within a few hours, the funeral director takes her away in a black plastic bag in a black van. A short time into the vigil, we were all saying, how could you let that happen? How, as a family, could we let some stranger just take Wendy off and put her in a fridge? Unquote. I don't know anything about death. I don't know the basics of what happens after we're gone, but I do know a few things. According to theconversation.com, there are no set time limits for disposal of the dead. Matter of fact, you have options on what you can do with your loved ones. Burial in a churchyard or cemetery isn't the only final resting places. There are burials in fields, seas, even on private land, much like Jean buried her sister. You're also not required to have a funeral director, nor do you have to place the deceased in a coffin. You can place them in a wicker basket if you want. There's also other methods besides cremation. There's resumation, which is, quote, a liquefaction process which uses alkaline hydrolysis to discover the body's organic matter inside a steel container, unquote. And promission, which, quote, uses liquid nitrogen to supercool the body before the brittle remains are shattered using ultrasonic vibration, unquote. But bear in mind that burial laws differ by state. In North Carolina, for example, there are no laws prohibiting a home burial. If your loved one dies at home, according to the Groundswell Project, you can keep the deceased for a maximum of 5 days, much like Russell did. I got a chance to say goodbye to my grandma before and way after her funeral. Truthfully, I hate funerals. I don't want my last image of someone I love to be them stuffed in a wooden box. I have so many memories of my grandma where she's healthy and happy and singing. Oh man, she loved to sing. What was that song called? It's Getting Late in the Evening. I'm not sure if y'all know it, but she would sing that song up and down all the time, just randomly. I wish I would have recorded her at least once. My dad sang at her funeral. That memory of her sitting in her favorite chair, belting her heart out, is the memory I choose to hold on to. It's how I grieved, but not a day goes by that I don't miss her. Much like Jean missed James and June, or Robert missed Richard Evelyn, or Russell and his family missed Wendy. Death is a thing that happens. It's what we all have to deal with. But it's how we deal with it that makes a difference. I'm Mrs. True Crime, and remember to be kind, be loud, be aware.
It's getting late y'all don't hear me. It's getting late. It's getting late. And the evening, the sun, yes, the sun is gone.